There was a moment in history when the name Portugal was not just a country at the edge of Europe, but the very center of an expanding world. From small harbors facing the Atlantic Ocean, wooden ships with white sails set out, carrying ambitions far greater than the land that gave them birth. In the 15th and 16th centuries, while much of Europe still hesitated before the vast unknown sea, the Portuguese chose to step straight into it. Under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, Portuguese sailors began tracing the coast of Africa, mile by mile, nautical league by nautical league. They were not searching only for gold or spices. They were searching for a route. A path to India that would free them from dependence on trade networks controlled by other empires. When Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, he did more than complete a voyage. He opened a new era, one in which the ocean became a global highway. Within just a few decades, a small nation with a modest population established a network of trade and colonies stretching from Brazil in South America to Angola and Mozambique in Africa, from Goa in India to Malacca in Southeast Asia, and Macau in China. Portugal became the first maritime empire of the modern age. Lisbon was not the quiet, picturesque city tourists see today. It was a financial hub, a naval powerhouse, a crossroads where gold, sugar, spices, and enslaved people flowed in from across the world. What stands out is not only the scale of the empire, but its audacity. Imagine a country smaller than many US states today, daring to challenge the ocean and rival European powers. It did not possess a vast population. It did not enjoy abundant domestic resources. What it had was advanced maritime technology, fierce determination, and an unshakable belief that its destiny lay beyond the horizon. Yet, like every empire in history, rapid expansion carried a heavy cost. The Portuguese Empire depended deeply on sea trade and distant colonies. When other powers such as Spain, the Netherlands, and later Britain entered the race, Portugal's early advantage began to erode. Trade routes faced competition. Colonies were attacked. Wealth no longer poured into Lisbon at the same pace. The 17th and 18th centuries marked a gradual decline. Though Portugal retained important colonies such as Brazil, it was no longer the dominant force it once had been. When Brazil declared independence in 1822, Portugal lost its greatest jewel. This was not merely the loss of territory. It was the loss of its main source of revenue, its strategic leverage, and a vital part of its imperial identity. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, Portugal faced persistent political instability. The monarchy collapsed in 1910, giving way to a young and turbulent republic. Coups, economic crises, and social unrest left the country fragile. From an empire that once commanded the seas, Portugal now struggled with its own internal fractures. In 1933, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar established the Estado Novo regime, an authoritarian government that lasted more than 4 decades. Under Salazar, Portuguese society was tightly controlled, free speech restricted, and political opposition suppressed. While much of Europe endured World War II and later rebuilt in its aftermath, Portugal maintained a conservative and isolated model. The remaining African colonies were held through military force, even as decolonization swept across the globe. The colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau during the 1960s and early 1970s drained national resources and exhausted society. Young soldiers were sent to fight distant wars while the domestic economy stagnated. The gap between the image of empire and the reality of a small struggling nation grew impossible to ignore. In 1974, the Carnation Revolution erupted. Remarkably, it unfolded with almost no bloodshed. Citizens and soldiers placed carnations into the barrels of their rifles, a symbol that marked the end of repression. The dictatorship fell, and the path toward democracy opened. But democracy did not immediately bring prosperity. The African colonies gained independence one after another. Hundreds of thousands of Portuguese settlers returned from Africa, creating intense economic and social pressure. From that point forward, Portugal officially entered a new chapter. No longer an empire, it became a European nation seeking to redefine itself. By joining the European Economic Community in 1986, Portugal began integrating deeply into the continent's economic and political structures. European Union funds helped modernize infrastructure, education, and industry. Lisbon and Porto transformed. Tourism expanded. The country's global image gradually shifted. Yet even with greater stability, Portugal's size no longer allowed it to shape global affairs in the way it once had. It no longer controlled ocean trade routes. It no longer governed colonies across continents. Instead, it became a member of the European bloc, sharing economic sovereignty and currency through the euro. The transition from empire to small nation was not just geographical. It was psychological. A people who once believed their destiny was to conquer the seas now had to learn how to live in a world where power rests with massive economies. Historical pride remained, but it was accompanied by the clear understanding that past glory does not automatically guarantee the future. And it is in this tension that Portugal's story becomes profound. It did not collapse. It did not disintegrate. It pulled inward, restructured, and adapted. From a transcontinental empire, it became a small, but stable nation rooted in democracy, integration, and a distinct cultural identity. The journey from the height of global power to today's modest position is not simply a story of failure. It is a story about the cycles of history. Every empire must eventually confront its limits. Every nation must answer the same question: when power declines, what will you do to survive? For Portugal, the answer was not to attempt to rebuild the empire. It was to accept a new role, to balance past and present, to reconcile maritime memory with European integration. And from that foundation, the paradoxes of modern Portugal began to take shape. If there is one place in Europe where you can see an effigy of a president of the United States turned into a giant caricature, mocked, dragged through the streets to music and laughter from hundreds of thousands of people, it is Portugal. And if you are an American viewer, the first question that may flash through your mind is this: is this freedom of speech at its highest form, or chaos legalized under the name of culture? Every year, in the city of Torres Vedras, the carnival takes place on a grand scale, carrying a tradition unlike any other. It is not just bright costumes and parade floats. It is towering effigies that portray global political leaders. From the President of the United States to the leader of Russia to powerful figures across Europe, anyone can become the target of satire. Their faces are exaggerated. Their expressions are distorted. They are placed in absurd, sometimes uncomfortable situations designed to provoke laughter and reflection. What is striking is that it all unfolds openly. There is no police crackdown. No ban. No prosecution for insulting a head of state. This is not a spontaneous protest. It is part of a tradition that stretches back hundreds of years. The Portuguese call it culture. They see it as the right to laugh at power. For Americans, whose First Amendment fiercely protects free speech, this feels both familiar and unsettling. In the United States, mocking presidents and politicians is common on television, social media, and late-night comedy shows. But the image of burning an effigy, or turning a world leader into a street spectacle crosses into sensitive territory. It raises an uncomfortable question about the boundary between freedom and respect. So what allows Portugal to sustain this tradition without descending into disorder? The answer lies in its history. The carnival in Torres Vedras dates back to the Middle Ages, when European society was rigidly stratified. During festival days, social order was temporarily inverted. Ordinary people could dress as kings, parody elites, and speak truths they would never dare utter in daily life. It functioned as a social pressure valve. A release of tension that prevented deeper unrest. When Portugal entered its long dictatorship from the 1930s to 1974, freedom of speech was tightly restricted. The press was censored. Opposition was silenced. In that climate, the desire to speak, to criticize, to satirize only grew stronger beneath the surface. The Carnation Revolution of 1974 did more than topple an authoritarian regime. It opened a new chapter in which freedom of expression became a core national value. So when you see those effigies paraded through the streets, you are not just witnessing mockery. You are witnessing a society that once lived in enforced silence and now refuses to return to it. Laughter becomes a symbol of liberty. Yet freedom always carries risk. In the United States, debates over the limits of free speech have grown increasingly intense. Social media amplifies misinformation. Political polarization ensures that nearly every statement can be interpreted through an extreme lens. When a society allows every voice, the question shifts from whether speech should be permitted to how respect and stability can be maintained. Portugal appears to have found a delicate balance. The festival exists within a defined space. It has a time, a context, and a tradition. People understand it as theatre, as exaggeration, as satire. When the festival ends, daily life resumes. The government does not collapse because an effigy is burned. Society does not erupt into riots over a caricature. This reflects a certain level of political maturity. Freedom does not mean anarchy. It is an unspoken agreement that the right to speak comes with the responsibility to preserve the social framework. When individuals understand their role within that framework, laughter does not tear down foundations. It simply releases pressure. Still, the question lingers. Can this model endure in the digital age? When an image from a festival can circle the globe in minutes, stripped of context and reframed as international controversy, pressure no longer comes only from within. An effigy mocking a foreign leader can trigger diplomatic tension. A single photograph can ignite outrage far beyond national borders. For the United States, a country that frequently becomes the focal point of global satire, Portugal's story offers a revealing perspective. The greater the power, the greater the likelihood of becoming a target of ridicule. A superpower must learn to withstand the laughter of the world. Meanwhile, a small nation like Portugal uses laughter as a tool to assert its identity. Here, freedom is not the denial of power. It is a psychological rebalancing of power. When citizens can laugh at leaders, they feel less dominated by them. They are not passive spectators of global politics. They become participants, even if only through satire. So is this freedom or anarchy? The answer depends on how a society defines its boundaries. In Portugal, those boundaries were shaped by history, by the memory of dictatorship, and by a peaceful transition to democracy. The Portuguese understand the cost of silence, so they guard the right to speak. But they also understand the cost of chaos, so they contain that speech within cultural and legal limits. This chapter is not simply about a festival. It is about how a small nation protects its freedom without sacrificing order. And from the vantage point of the United States, where debates over free expression remain heated and unresolved, the Portuguese example becomes a mirror worth studying. Because in the end, the issue is not whether you have the right to laugh at power. The real issue is whether your society is strong enough to endure that laughter without falling apart. And in Portugal, at least for now, the answer appears to be yes. If empire was once the source of Portugal's power in the past, then tourism is its new empire in the present. No longer wooden ships sailing out of Lisbon's harbour, but low-cost flights landing in Faro, cruise ships anchored off the Algarve, waves of visitors pouring onto beaches bathed in year-round sunlight. The Atlantic is still there. But instead of carrying conquest and ambition, it now carries cash flow. Over the past 2 decades, Portugal has become one of Europe's fastest-growing destinations. Lisbon is ranked among the most livable and most desirable cities to visit. Porto has emerged as a symbol of old-world architecture blended with modern energy. The Algarve, with its towering cliffs and crystal blue waters, attracts millions each year. Tourism accounts for a significant share of GDP, provides jobs for hundreds of thousands, and helped rescue the economy after the 2008 financial crisis. From an American perspective, this sounds familiar. Many U.S. cities rely on tourism to reinvent themselves. Las Vegas, Orlando, Miami, New Orleans. Tourism brings life, creates jobs, fuels service industries. But any economy that leans too heavily on a single revenue stream eventually faces risk. And Portugal is beginning to feel that cost. Look at the seaside city of Albufeira in the Algarve. Once a quiet fishing village where families gathered along the harbour, Albufeira has transformed into a party capital for international tourists. Bars stay open all night. Music echoes until dawn. Young visitors from across Europe arrive seeking limitless freedom. Apartments are converted into short-term rentals. Housing prices surge beyond what local residents can afford. With the influx of money comes fierce competition in the service sector, including in sensitive industries. Women working in adult entertainment promote themselves in multiple languages, competing not only with each other, but with a global online marketplace. Prices are clearly listed. Images carefully curated. This is not simply a moral story. It is a reflection of an economy where supply and demand are pushed to their limits. When a city begins to shape itself more around the needs of tourists than the needs of residents, identity starts to shift. Local grocery stores give way to souvenir shops. Family-owned restaurants turn into chains catering to foreign tastes. English is heard more often than Portuguese. For many locals, there is a growing sense of becoming guests in their own homeland. In Lisbon and Porto, the pattern is even more visible. The explosion of short-term rental platforms has removed thousands of apartments from the long-term housing market. Home prices rise rapidly. Young people struggle to find affordable places to live. Neighborhoods that were once tight-knit communities become transient zones, changing faces every week as visitors arrive and depart. The Portuguese government has not stood idle. It has imposed restrictions on short-term rental licenses in certain areas, increased taxes on foreign real estate investment, and attempted to balance growth with preservation. But the question is not easy to answer. When tourism brings in billions of euros each year, who is willing to walk away from that revenue? The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the fragility of this model with brutal clarity. When borders closed and flights stopped, hotels emptied. Restaurants shut down. Thousands lost their jobs. An economy dependent on international visitors suddenly froze. For many Americans, that memory is not distant. U.S. tourist cities endured the same shock. After the pandemic, tourism roared back, even surpassing previous levels. But its return brought greater pressure. More visitors. Higher prices. Rising social tension. Protests against over-tourism began appearing not only in Portugal but across Europe. Residents started asking a difficult question: is growth worth it if it erodes quality of life? At its core, tourism is an exchange. Visitors seek experience, culture, landscape. The host nation seeks revenue, employment, international recognition. But when the balance tilts too far in one direction, exchange turns into dependency. And dependency always carries risk. Portugal now stands at a crossroads. On one hand, it cannot deny that tourism helped it recover from crisis, modernize infrastructure, and elevate its global image. On the other, it must confront the reality that no sustainable future can rest solely on crowded summer seasons. For the United States, this story is a reminder. When an economy concentrates too heavily on one sector, whether tourism, technology, or energy, diversification becomes essential for stability. When a city becomes overwhelmingly attractive to outsiders, it must ask how to preserve its soul. In Portugal, the cost of tourism is not measured only in euros. It is measured in altered communities, housing pressure, sleepless nights for residents living amid party districts, and the quiet feeling that home is slowly turning into a product. And the larger question remains. A nation that once controlled ocean trade routes now receives the reverse flow, as the world pours into its beaches and old quarters. Can it control that flow, or will it be swept away by it? Tourism brings light and opportunity. But like every new empire, it demands vigilance. Portugal is learning to balance openness with preservation, profit with identity, growth with sustainability. And in that tension, we see a small nation determined not to repeat the mistake of expanding too fast without counting the long-term cost. If tourism represents modern Portugal, vibrant, restless, and constantly in motion, then in another corner of this country there exists a world that feels almost suspended in time. On the windswept granite slopes of Baía Baixa stands a village where people did not build homes to conquer nature, but to blend into it. Here, stone is not an obstacle. Stone is the roof, the wall, the memory. The village of Monsanto is often called one of the strangest villages in Europe. When you arrive for the first time, the first sensation is not comfort or modern convenience. It is humility. Massive boulders, weighing hundreds of tons, lie stacked as if dropped from the sky. And between those stones, human beings carved out space, building houses, windows, stairways, red-tiled roofs tucked carefully beneath enormous slabs of grey rock. In many parts of the world, when confronted with difficult terrain, people flatten it. They blast through rock, level foundations, and rebuild from scratch. But in Monsanto, generation after generation chose a different path. They turned stone into architecture. A giant boulder becomes a natural wall. A narrow gap between rocks becomes a kitchen. A protruding slab becomes shade against the harsh summer sun. This is more than architectural creativity. It is a philosophy of living. Instead of fighting nature, they adapted to it. In winter, the stone retains heat, keeping homes warmer. In summer, the massive rocks cast cooling shadows against the dry heat. Every house is a unique solution, not drawn from standardized blueprints, not shaped by modern suburban grids. For an American audience accustomed to neatly planned suburbs where houses mirror each other down to the smallest detail, Monsanto feels like a painting from another era. There are no highways cutting through the hills. No shopping malls. Narrow lanes twist between rock and stone homes, wide enough for a small car, and in many stretches only wide enough for pedestrians and pack animals. Yet within that simplicity, time seems to slow. You do not hear constant car horns. You hear wind moving through stone crevices. You hear footsteps echoing on ancient pavement. And you begin to understand that in a world obsessed with speed, this place stands as a quiet testament to endurance. Not far from Monsanto is Casa do Penedo, a house built between four enormous boulders, as if nature had prepared its foundation long before human hands arrived. From a distance, it looks like something out of a fairy tale rather than a real dwelling. The doors, windows, and roof are carefully placed between giant rocks. Inside, there is a fireplace, simple furniture, and basic living essentials. But what makes it famous is not only its unusual form. It is the symbol of how humans can claim space in the natural world without destroying it. Still, living among stone is not purely romantic. Life here is harsh. Winters are bitterly cold, mountain winds cutting through every opening. Summers are scorching and dry. In the past, transporting building materials, food, and supplies depended on donkeys and human strength. Today there is electricity and running water, but many modern conveniences remain less accessible than in the cities. The population of villages like Monsanto is small. Many young people leave in search of opportunity in Lisbon, Porto, or elsewhere in the European Union. Those who remain are often older. This reflects a broader reality in Portugal, a tension between tradition and modernity, between rural life and urban growth. And here, the story of time becomes unmistakable. Thick stone walls can endure for centuries. But can the community within them sustain its vitality? A house may stand firm against wind and storm, but a village needs people to survive. For the United States, where many small towns also struggle with population decline and economic stagnation, Monsanto is more than a unique tourist stop. It is a reminder that sustainability is not only about materials. It is about people. A place can last for centuries if it finds balance between preservation and renewal. In recent years, Monsanto and other stone villages have drawn visitors seeking something different. They come to take photographs, to experience silence, to step away from digital noise. Tourism brings new revenue, but it also introduces a challenge. How do you open your doors to the world without turning an ancient village into a theme park? Living among stone and time is not merely a story about architecture. It is a symbol of a nation trying to preserve its ancient soul while stepping fully into the 21st century. While coastal cities wrestle with the pressures of tourism and global markets, the stone villages remind us that Portugal's depth stretches far beyond resorts and festivals. Here, stone represents endurance. Time represents change. And people stand between those forces, searching for adaptation. They cannot return to the age of empire. They cannot halt modernization. But they can choose to safeguard their core values. When you walk among the giant boulders and see sunlight pouring through a small window, you understand that survival does not always require scale. Sometimes it requires patience. One stone placed carefully. One house shaped by the land. One small but tightly bound community. In a world growing flatter and more uniform, where major cities resemble one another in glass and steel, Portugal's stone villages declare that identity can be carved into the landscape itself. As time moves forward, the rocks remain, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of empires, to political shifts, to economic cycles. People come and go. But if they learn to live in harmony with their foundation, they can leave a mark far more lasting than any fleeting power. A quiet paradox is unfolding in Portugal. While the beaches remain crowded, festivals stay lively, and historic cities glow each night, a slower but serious crisis is forming beneath the surface of society. It is not war. Not a financial collapse. It is the absence of children. Portugal's birth rate ranks among the lowest in Europe. On average, each woman has fewer than 2 children, the level required to maintain a stable population. In some periods, the number has fallen below 1. This means that each new generation is smaller than the one before it. Classrooms in rural areas are gradually emptying. Small towns see schools close due to a lack of students. Maternity wards record fewer births while nursing homes continue to expand. For American audiences, where debates about family life, the cost of raising children, and work-life balance continue, Portugal's story is a visible version of a possible future. When young people delay marriage, postpone having children, or decide not to have them at all, the consequences do not appear immediately. They accumulate year after year, decade after decade. There are multiple intertwined causes. After the 2008 financial crisis and the European sovereign debt crisis, Portugal endured a period of austerity, high unemployment, and economic instability. Hundreds of thousands of young people left the country seeking opportunities in the United Kingdom, Germany, France, or further abroad. Emigration not only reduces the current population, but also removes those who might have children in the future. The rapid rise in living costs while incomes fail to keep pace is another major factor. Housing prices in Lisbon and Porto have surged due to tourism and foreign investment. Young people struggle to buy homes and even to secure long-term rentals. When the economic foundation is unstable, the decision to have children becomes more of a financial burden than a simple joy. The Portuguese government is well aware of this issue. In some small towns, local authorities have introduced cash support policies for each newborn child. Certain municipalities provide thousands of euros per birth, along with tax incentives, extended parental leave, and family allowances. The goal is to encourage couples not to postpone having children. But the question remains whether money alone is enough to change such long-term personal decisions. In many other European countries, from Italy to Germany, similar financial support programs have been implemented with limited success. When the core problems lie in job insecurity, housing pressure, and shifting social values, an initial financial bonus cannot solve everything. Portugal now faces a rapidly aging population structure. The proportion of people over 65 is rising while the young labor force is shrinking. This creates pressure on the pension system, healthcare services, and the national budget. When fewer workers must support more retirees, the financial burden increases. In the United States, although the population is larger and immigration levels are higher, declining birth rates are also emerging as a trend. Discussions about the future of Social Security, retirement age, and attracting immigrant labor are becoming increasingly urgent. Portugal's story serves as a warning of what may happen if this trend continues without comprehensive solutions. Another important factor is the shift in perceptions of family. Young generations in Portugal, like in many Western countries, prioritize education, careers, and personal experiences before considering children. Women attain higher levels of education and participate more in the labor market. This represents a major achievement in gender equality, but it also changes the timing and number of births. As the average age at first childbirth rises, the average number of children tends to fall. The reproductive window shortens, medical risks increase, and many couples choose to stop at one child or have none at all. This does not reflect a decline in family values, but rather a shift in priorities and living conditions. One widely discussed solution is immigration. Portugal has become more open to foreign labor in recent years. Brazilians, Portuguese-speaking Africans, and other communities have moved to the country, bringing youthful energy and contributing to the economy. Immigration can partially offset population decline, but it also raises challenges regarding cultural integration and social policy. The larger question concerns how a nation defines its future. If population trends continue downward, Portugal could lose millions of people in the coming decades. Rural regions will become more sparsely populated. Small towns risk disappearing. The pension system will need adjustment. The social structure will change. A demographic crisis is not as loud as a financial crisis. There are no stock market charts collapsing in a single day. No images of long lines outside banks. Instead, it is a gradual process. A classroom with fewer students. A hospital with more elderly patients. A house without the sound of children. Yet within the challenge lies opportunity. Portugal can restructure its economy toward high technology and innovation, reducing dependence on a large labor force. It can invest in more comprehensive family policies, from housing to affordable childcare. It can leverage selective immigration to renew its workforce. For the United States, the lesson is not to copy Portugal's specific policies, but to recognize long-term trends. As populations age, today's policy decisions will shape social structures for decades to come. A nation needs not only economic growth, but generational balance. Portugal's demographic crisis is a story about a future that is approaching. It raises the question of whether a country that once expanded across the globe can sustain its internal vitality. And within that question lies not only Portugal, but many other nations quietly confronting the same challenge. In a country that was once an empire, that once conquered the oceans and later retreated into modern Europe, there is one thing that has never shrunk with the size of its map. That is pride. And in Portugal, that pride takes the shape of a ball. Football is not merely a sport in Portugal. It is a story of identity. It is how a small nation tells the world that it is still present. That it can still stand alongside powers with larger populations and greater resources. If in the 15th century they used ships to reach distant lands, then in the 20th and 21st centuries they have used football to reach the hearts of billions. The story truly exploded in 1966, when Portugal first shocked the world at the World Cup. Led by Eusebio, a forward born in Mozambique when it was still a Portuguese colony, this small national team advanced to the semifinals and finished third overall. Eusebio did more than score goals. He became a symbol. A black player representing a European nation at a time when the world was still filled with prejudice. With his powerful shots and astonishing speed, he forced the world to pay attention to Portugal. For American audiences, where sports are often tied to stories of overcoming adversity, Eusebio embodied the dream. A boy from an African colony rising to become a global star. A small nation stepping onto the world's biggest stage. It was not only a sporting victory. It was a moment of national confidence. But after that brilliance, Portugal entered a quieter period. Major tournaments passed without significant impact. While Brazil, Germany, Italy, and Argentina continued building championship traditions, Portugal had to wait. They did not have a large enough population to produce waves of talent every generation. They had to rely on rare golden generations. The 1990s brought renewed hope with names like Luis Figo, Rui Costa, and later Deco. This was a technical, creative, and charismatic generation. They put Portugal back on the European football map. The peak came at UEFA Euro 2004, hosted on home soil. The entire nation was immersed in expectation. Public squares were packed with viewers. There was belief that history would be rewritten on home ground. But that final became one of the most painful memories. Portugal lost to Greece, a team widely considered inferior. For fans, it was not just a sporting defeat. It was a psychological shock. Once again, the dream of glory seemed to slip away. Then one name began to shine more brightly than all the others: Cristiano Ronaldo. Born on the island of Madeira and raised in a modest family, Ronaldo represents the image of limitless ambition. He left home at a young age to pursue his career, enduring harsh years in a demanding training environment. Discipline, ambition, and iron will transformed him into one of the greatest players in history. For American audiences, where stories of individual success are celebrated, Ronaldo is a perfect example of a refusal to accept limits. He did not only win club titles with Manchester United, Real Madrid, and Juventus. He carried the hopes of an entire nation every time he wore the national jersey. UEFA Euro 2016 in France was the turning point. Portugal entered the tournament not as the leading favourite. They advanced through the group stage with multiple draws, progressing step by step with patience and discipline. In the final against France, Ronaldo left the field early due to injury. Many believed the dream had shattered again. But in that very moment, the Portuguese team showed what mattered most. They were no longer dependent on a single individual. They fought as a collective. And when the decisive goal was scored, the entire country erupted. It was Portugal's first major international title at the national team level. A small nation finally had a European trophy. Not through overwhelming dominance, but through persistence. For many, it closed decades of waiting. Football in Portugal does not exist only at the national level. Domestically, the three major clubs, Benfica, FC Porto, and Sporting CP, create fierce rivalries. Stadiums are packed with supporters. Derbies are not merely sporting contests, but expressions of regional identity and history. Young talent is systematically trained, and many later shine in Europe's top leagues. What is remarkable is that Portugal, despite its small population, has become one of the world's leading producers of football talent. Academies emphasize technique, tactics, and adaptability. When Portuguese players compete abroad, they carry not only skill, but the spirit of a nation long accustomed to pushing beyond its limits. As the country faces demographic crisis, economic pressure, and social change, football becomes a thread of unity. When the national team plays, differences are temporarily set aside. Young and old, urban and rural residents all share a common emotion. That is the power of a symbol. For the United States, where football is growing rapidly, but is not yet the dominant sport, Portugal's story shows the role sports can play in shaping national identity. A team does not change GDP. It does not directly solve demographic decline. But it creates belief. And belief is difficult to measure, yet profoundly important. When you look at Portugal, you see a nation that is no longer a maritime empire, no longer controlling colonies, no longer shaping global politics. Yet every time the ball rolls, it can still command the world's attention. In the roar of stadiums, in the red and green flag waving, in tears after victory or defeat, one thing is clear. Even if the map has shrunk, pride has not. And perhaps in an era when national power is measured not only by military or economic strength, but also by cultural and emotional influence, football is the last empire Portugal still holds. There are nations remembered for military strength. There are nations known for enormous economies. And there are nations which, though small in size and modest in population, leave a mark on the world's mind through something far less tangible. That is identity. Portugal belongs to this third group. Looking back at its journey from maritime empire to a humble nation on the edge of Europe, one can easily see the rises and falls. From the era of ships cutting through the Atlantic, to periods of revolution, economic crisis, waves of emigration, and the pressures of globalization. Each chapter of history has left a deep imprint. But what makes Portugal remarkable is not only what it once possessed, but the way it accepted a reduction in power without losing dignity. For American audiences, where stories of rise and decline are often analyzed through the lens of global power, Portugal raises a different question. What remains when imperial glory fades? What keeps a nation from dissolving among larger and wealthier powers? The answer does not lie in maps or economic indicators. It lies in culture, in collective memory, and in the way a country tells its own story. Portugal does not seek to reclaim dominance over the oceans. It does not attempt to compete through sheer scale. Instead, it invests in things that endure. Architectural heritage is preserved. Fado music resonates like a whisper from history. The cobbled streets of Lisbon and Porto serve not only tourism, but remind citizens of the depth of time beneath their feet. That calmness is not weakness. It is another form of confidence, one that does not require display. In today's global context, as many nations confront identity crises, internal divisions, and economic pressure, Portugal's story suggests another possibility. You can become smaller in scale without becoming smaller in value. You may no longer control the world, yet you can still contribute to it through culture, sport, and way of life. Consider football, where Portugal has found a global language. Victories are not merely about trophies. They symbolize how a small nation can still compete fairly on the grandest stage. But football is only part of the picture. The growth of tourism reflects the appeal of a slower, deeper way of living. Open social policies reveal a desire to adapt rather than confront. Together, these elements form a consistent image of a nation that understands its limits and knows how to turn those limits into strengths. The deeper message lies in balance. Portugal once endured isolation under dictatorship. It also opened rapidly and faced economic consequences. Through each phase, it learned that extremes are rarely sustainable. Stability comes from adjustment, from acknowledging mistakes and changing direction when necessary. That lesson is not only for a small European nation, but for any society searching for its place in the 21st century. For the United States, a superpower with far-reaching influence, this story carries a reflective quality. Power is not permanent. Influence can shift over time. But core values, if properly nurtured, can outlast any economic or political cycle. Portugal demonstrates that identity is not determined by military size or GDP, but by how citizens perceive themselves and their future. Demographic crisis, housing pressure driven by tourism, dependence on a service-based economy, these remain real challenges. No picture is entirely rosy. Yet what stands out is how this society engages with its problems. Not through denial, but through public discussion and gradual reform. It may be slow. It may be imperfect. But it is a process aimed at sustainability. Ultimately, what makes Portugal distinctive is neither a glorious past nor a dazzling present. It is the ability to live alongside time. Ancient stone walls are not merely relics. They are proof that a people can move through centuries of upheaval while preserving their soul. In a world obsessed with speed and growth, that endurance becomes a quiet form of strength. If there is a message to draw, it is this: greatness is measured not only by reach, but by depth. A nation may be small in territory yet vast in heritage. Modest in population yet rich in culture. And in an era when everything changes rapidly, the ability to maintain identity while adapting to the future may be the most admirable achievement of all. Portugal today is no longer the empire of ships crossing oceans. But it is an empire of memory, of music, of football, of cities where past and present coexist on every cobblestone. It does not need to expand its borders to assert itself. It does so through the way it lives, through the way it tells its story to the world. And perhaps that is what makes this story worth hearing to the very end. Not because it speaks of a distant nation on the edge of Europe, but because it asks a question of us all. When power shifts, when the world moves, what remains? If the answer is identity, memory, and the capacity to adapt, then Portugal has found its path. And in that quietness, it sends the world a message more powerful than any declaration.